Facebook had known there was a problem, 44 US states said, you intentionally hurt kids, like you knew what you were doing was hurting kids and you continued on. You had ways of fixing it. You chose not to use them. You lied and said your products were safe. And lastly, you've lied about not having under 13-year-olds on your platform, which is a violation of the Children's Online Privacy Act. We've seen since then kind of a cascade of actions take place around the world. One of the things that I worry a lot in like the sports space is the rise of fitness influencers who, both for boys and for girls, set really unrealistic expectations around like what is appropriate physical fitness. You know, a lot of that are artifacts of how these products are designed. It's even changing how they conceptualize what it means to move or what it means to be healthy. And do we really want, an algorithm that is optimized on business interests, not even on the well-being of our kids, to be the thing that guides them down that path? Don't include measures that are trying to understand how does this impact how much time your kid goes outside and plays. Your system will just keep optimizing for the metrics you do have in the basket, which are largely business metrics.
And so there's a prioritization of profit over safety.
Unquestionably. So a thing that most people don't understand is there's only one person's voice in the world that actually matters about Meta, about Facebook, which is Mark Zuckerberg. There's a lot of money out there being thrown around at nonprofits that tell us there are no solutions, or they create FUD saying, the data is really not in on whether or not kids are hurt by these things. And the thing I always like to remind parents on is, Mark Zuckerberg is going out on podcasts right now and repeating that over and over again. And yet the only person in the world who can actually allow that data to be collected, those, how the studies just don't exist, is Mark Zuckerberg. And so I find it very disingenuous when he's like, people really just don't understand how the data is not there. And it's like, yes, Mark, because you make sure the data is not there.
Before we start, thank you for all the DMs and great feedback on Cool Conversations, which I love to hear, so keep it coming. And what would help us even more is if you choose to subscribe. It helps me to bring you more amazing guests and cool conversations. Now let's dive into the episode. Francis, welcome to Cool Conversations. And for those who may not know about your work, you are a data engineer and algorithmic expert, known primarily for your revelations as the whistleblower behind the Facebook files, which sparked a global dialogue about the impact of social media, and especially on our kids. And I'd love for you to maybe just take us back to your time at Facebook as a product manager on the civic misinformation team, and what specific data findings that you uncovered around public safety and even children's well-being.
So the work that I did primarily at Facebook was focused on the role of Facebook's products in social stability around the world. So I came into Facebook thinking I was going to be contributing to the preparations for the US 2020 election. It was 2019 after all. I lived in many ways the mindset that I criticize today of how a lot of these companies operate, and that most American employees don't think about what the implications of their products are on other parts of the world. It's just not a thing that people do on the regular. And unfortunately, when you run the global telecommunication system for the world, including often basically what is the internet for some of the most fragile places in the world, you end up in situations where your choices about what to spend money on from a safety perspective have really serious consequences. One of the smaller issues that I brought out documents on, though it's unquestionably been the one that has had the larger impact in the world, was around kids' well-being, kids' mental health. What did Facebook know about its own role in these problems? What did Facebook try to do to address them? Why hadn't they acted? And because there was now concrete proof that Facebook had known there was a problem, that Facebook had even run experiments trying to address problems, and then then not used those learnings to make their products safer. We've seen since then kind of a cascade of actions take place around the world. So in the United States, we have a tradition of sometimes we run into problems that we have trouble passing laws about, even though they're glaring, clear, huge societal issues. This could be tobacco. This could be the opiate crisis. In both those cases, the individual states came together and filed a lawsuit saying, hey, we know you lied about the safety of your products. In some cases, you intentionally continued, even though you knew what you're doing was harming people, there needs to be consequences. In the case of Facebook, they brought a lawsuit about a year ago where 44 US states said, you intentionally hurt kids, like you knew what you were doing was hurting kids and you continued on. You had ways of fixing it. You chose not to use them. You lied and said your products were safe. And lastly, you've lied about not having under 13-year-olds on your platform, which is a violation of the Children's Online Privacy Act. It's been super interesting to see how these things have played out because, well, I could only bring out a very limited amount of material. Because remember, I didn't actually work on kids' safety. It's the thing that I'm famous for, but it's not the thing that was my core issue. I brought out maybe 5,000 pages about kid safety, maybe 3,000 pages, like not a ton. But they've been able to bring out huge amounts of information. Like today, like I can send you a spreadsheet that links off to thousands of pages of Facebook files in much prettier file formats than what I got out, that are evidence that has been released because of these lawsuits. And that has built onto another wave. We're starting to see things like Canada and Australia taking another bite at the apple and saying, how can we make our online safety laws better for kids? Or we're seeing things like the US Surgeon General saying we should have a public warning on these products, warning about the dangers for kids.
Absolutely. It really has created a huge ripple effect. And if I'm correct in saying it was through your testimony at Senate, it was you called out specifically like Facebook's algorithm and the platform design decisions that were like fundamental to these issues. At the time, what were the features that were particularly concerning to you? And if we could maybe relate it to children or how it might affect them.
Sure. So I think one of the things that we take for granted is that, social media is a thing, right? That it is immutable, it's unchanging. We look at things like Instagram, and, Instagram largely has been a stream of rectangles and squares for a long time. Maybe they have some videos in there now. Maybe there's some other things thrown in. But, it doesn't seem like it's changed that much over the last 10 plus years. At the software that is focusing your attention, that is making choices about what you get to consume or don't get to consume on any given day, the product is very, very different. And one of the core things that I was trying to emphasize for people in my Senate testimony was that very small decisions about how we design those software programs, those algorithms, have really serious consequences. So one of the things that I think a lot of people liked about Instagram back when it first launched was that you got to choose who you heard from. You went and picked your friends, you picked influencers you liked, you got to curate the experience that you consumed. If someone maybe started focusing on an area of topicality that you weren't interested in, if you wanted to change your information diet, you had a lot of control to do that. And over the last few years, Instagram has come out and said, we know that you like that, but if we were able to show you all those potentially glorious content that we have in our databases, you would hang out for a longer amount of time every day. The only problem is when we put ourselves from the hands of people we've chosen to saying, I want to be guided by an unaccountable corporate for-profit algorithm, certain problems begin to creep in. So one of the big issues that I wanted people to understand was that the process of how these systems are developed comes out of a management philosophy. So I had a memoir come out last year called The Power of One. It has lots of fun stories in it. It's meant to be like a policy book for people who don't like policy books. But I walked through in quite a lot of depth. I was really struck by how nice my coworkers were, right? Generally, people who work on social software are nice people. Like they care about people or they won't work on social software. And yet you have to ask, how does a whole bunch of nice people make such a long series of potentially catastrophic decisions? And to give you a sense, these systems are very powerful in that they can sort through billions of pieces of content to find the 10 pieces they think you're going to like the most. But they don't understand the difference between you did a search for healthy recipes because you were going to cook your mom dinner a couple days ago and what is pro-anorexia content, right? There's a very fine line between that. There's a lot of criticism of things like nutritionalists that will go and put out calorically unrealistic meals, sports influencers that will talk about what they eat in a day. The computer isn't very smart. It can't really tell those shades of gray. But it does know if you consume more of content like this, you spend more time on the platform. It doesn't understand that part of the reason why you may be staying up till 2 scrolling is because you're feeling so anxious that because the content you're consuming is actually making you want to self-soothe more.
Right. And so the idea is here that algorithms will try to push content that will go hyper
Mm-hmm.
viral to keep you on the platform, but often this content can be quite extreme content or unsuitable content for
It doesn't
use.
even have to be hyper viral content, right? It's a question of,
Okay.
I'll give you an example. Did an interview 2 years ago with a new father, and he had just had a brand new, healthy, cute, adorable baby boy. And he's a modern father, so he made an Instagram account for the baby. And that baby had 5 other little baby friends, little baby ecosystem of Instagram accounts. The only pictures he ever clicked on, he ever put a comment on, ever put a heart on, were cute, healthy, happy babies. And yet about 10% of his feed wasn't these cute, healthy, happy babies he had engaged with. It was suffering children. It was kids who had disfiguring accidents, kids who were laying in hospital beds with tubes coming out of them, kids who had deformities that looked really painful. The algorithm didn't understand the idea that if you're a new father, perhaps the most cruel content you can show a person is pictures of children suffering. But it did have almost certainly a signal in the feed that said, if you stop and dwell, not even you click, you stop and dwell, that lingering is a sign of interest. And so when you have these content agnostic algorithms, you don't have the emotional valence of content. Content that makes you feel insecure may not be super viral content, but it may make you stay on the platform a lot longer. And in a world where they make more money from the number of minutes you spend on the platform, the number of ads you click on during those minutes, they don't have an intrinsic interest to understand what are those side effects of the optimizations they make for their own business interests.
And so there's a prioritization of profit over safety. And is it essentially then, does it come down to behind the wall of these social media tech companies, does it come down to a select few through the design of these algorithms that are essentially holding the key to our attention, but also to maybe our well-being?
Unquestionably. So a thing that most people don't understand is there's only one person's voice in the world that actually matters about Meta, about Facebook, which is Mark Zuckerberg has a special kind of voting shares called Class A and Class B voting shares. And each of his shares has 10 times as many votes as a normal share does. And as a result, he controls over 55% of all the votes for the company. So when we go inside of Facebook and we ask questions around priorities, like why isn't more effort done around understanding if kids are struggling? Or let's be honest, it's probably only about 20% of kids that are do badly, like really badly on these platforms. Like Facebook has said this themselves in public. They've gone in front of the Senate and said 4 out of 5 kids are fine. Only 1 in 5 is having problems, which is catastrophic when you think about it. But inside these companies, part of the challenge is, when you manage with numbers, when you manage with metrics, you can only capture what you intentionally put in your basket of assessment metrics. If you don't include measures that are trying to understand how does this impact how much time your kid goes outside and plays, or how does this impact your child's real world relationships with their friends? How does this impact whether or not your child receives unwanted sexual communications? And surprise, for girls between the ages of 13 and 15, it's 1 in 8 girls got an unwanted sexual communication in the last 7 days. If you don't include these kinds of what we call guardrail metrics, your system will just keep optimizing for the metrics you do have in the basket, which are largely business metrics.
And are you saying then that if we take the example of Facebook now Meta and Mark's control of that in terms of the direction of which it goes, are you saying then that he has ignored the idea of the types of metrics that matter to kids' health and prioritize the ones for the business even to this day, despite all of the...
Yeah. So part of why I can be so empathetic about, how he's approached these things is until I went and documented these issues, on Instagram, I never thought about them, right? And it's one of the things that I think parents really, really need to understand, kids need to really understand, is that the people who build these products, so that's the engineers, that's the designers, the product managers, the scientists, almost none of them have a child over the age of 11. And that's because, a lot of the founding cohort came in when they were 19, 20. People generally have kids a little bit older in Silicon Valley. When you put all that together, Mark's oldest child is only 8. Adam Mosseri's oldest child is only 8. They're not living with the consequences for their own children or their children's friends of the choices they're making on these platforms. And so I think the situation is that it's very easy to come in there and say, kids have always had eating disorders. Kids have always had social anxiety. Kids have always been suicidal. But if you're not living with the consequences, you're not seeing how these kids are changing, it's really easy to tell yourself a story saying, well, COVID had a big impact on people. Oh, parents play a really big role. It's very easy to make it not your problem if you have a financial interest in it not being your problem.
Instagram have just unveiled teen accounts, I see, with more supervision tools for parents. Is this sufficient?
We've seen a lot of movement from them in the last couple of weeks. So for context for folks, and because I hope none of you watch Facebook news as closely as I do, or Instagram news. One of the big changes that came out was they said, hey, for all accounts for 16-year-olds and younger, we are going to start having private accounts by default. That means people can only see your content. You're only really visible on Instagram if someone has requested to be a friend and you've accepted them. Okay. And part of the reason for doing that is, when we talk about things like unwanted sexual communications, when we talk about people exploiting kids, things like sextortion, the only way you can do those things is if you can find the kids. The thing that's a little interesting about that announcement and the other features they announced alongside it is the way that they announced it. So in software engineering, people like to think software engineers are smart people. We can conjure all sorts of magic off of computers. The reality is, if you actually dig into the guts of where does a software engineering project come from, and you say, hey, when are you going to be done? You said that you have this thing, it's almost done. What does that mean? Are you going to be done in a week? Are you going to be done in 2 weeks? How about 3 weeks? When do you think you can actually turn it live for everyone to see? And when I worked at Google all the way back in 2007, we got banned on the search quality team from doing that because far too often people, we'd have some big press thing that was coming up, and they, all these journalism sources had come. We were so confident we were going to be done with 2 weeks to spare, and it just wasn't quite done. And so they would pre-announce it's going out in the next 24 hours. It's going out in the next 48 hours. And it would turn into just a disaster time and time again. And so they said, you are not reliable. You cannot pre-announce things. And so the fact that, Meta came out there and said, hey, we're going to be doing these child safety things, not now, but at some point in the next 60 days, that is incredibly rare. It's incredibly rare to have a software company do that. And so my read on it is I think something very large is about to happen. Either they're going to settle the US case, the one with the 44 state AGs, or they're doing this in response to the fact that Australia has made public announcements that they're going to ban social media for under 16s before the end of the year. Either of those would be on about the right time cadence to be aligned with that. And I think the reason they're doing it is they want to be able to say, if they were to settle, for example, they turned off notifications between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. They want to be able to say, we didn't turn it off. So in this launch, I think what's missing is they didn't turn off the notifications during the school day. You're like, right. They'll turn off.
Yes.
We'll turn off during the school day. Now they can come out and say, we already were turning them off at night. We'll expand it to include during the school day. Or, we already had parent accounts for public accounts. Now we have parent accounts for all kids. Or, one of the features is they'll let kids say, I want more content from sports, from comedy, from arts and crafts, whatever. But they don't have an option right now to say kids exclusively get what they request, right? Which would be a more privacy sensitive way of doing it, or give them more control, have less algorithmic danger. And so when I look at it, I see it as a symbol, not of so much that they've finally, realized in the depths of their heart they need to act differently. It's that some constraints are at play. Because from a strategic perspective, locking down under 16 accounts like this when TikTok isn't is a huge strategic disadvantage. And so I'm assuming something else is forcing their hand here.
That was exactly my question, because if TikTok is not, that's where the kids are going to go, or that's where customers will go when attention is premium. And so your sense of this is potentially in advance of the lawsuits or Australia's decision, that this is a chance to get ahead of that, rather than actually a desire to actually improve public safety. Because my understanding is that these teen accounts are actually not in place yet. It's that 60-day
They're
window.
not. They're still not.
If they were really serious, I mean, you alluded to, not turning on notifications during school day. If they were really intentional about making a difference, what would you have liked to have seen them announce? What would the announcement include?
If they had been really serious about issues around kids' health, they would have not just come out and said, we're going to do these grand gestures. They would have also said, hey, these issues are important enough that we want you to come on this journey with us. We're going to start doing polling, and we're going to ask kids, hey, does Meta interfere with your schoolwork? Does Instagram interfere with your ability to sleep at night? And we're going to start releasing that polling data on a regular basis. This was a suggestion made a full year ago by the last major Facebook whistleblower, Arturo Bejar, at his Senate hearing, who came out last fall said. So he had a big Senate hearing. He said, it's not enough for Facebook to publish metrics saying things like only 0.05% of content on Instagram is self-harm content. You need to ask kids, did you witness self-harm content in the last 7 days? Did you experience bullying? Did you witness bullying in the last 7 days? Because that's what actually matters, is how kids perceive these experiences. And Facebook didn't do that. They didn't come out and say, hey, we convened a panel of kids and asked them what problems they wanted solved. They didn't say, hey, here's the data that we're going to make sure you have access to so that you know that we're serious. And so it has a lot of trappings of being a PR event versus an actual well-intentioned intervention.
From our perspective, if we're looking at kids' movement and not just the mental health aspect, but physical well-being through movement, many of us grew up with free play and no social media, and now today's kids are experiencing the opposite of this, with the algorithms driving that sticky online behavior and somewhat displacing play. And I know Jonathan Hyde has, had done a lot on this and called, I suppose, this transition from a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood, this great rewiring. From your perspective, what do you see as the way forward here, with a view that what changes do we need to see? You've talked about like some of the questions and the data and the metrics that we need to be asking, or these companies need to be accountable for.
It's interesting. We think a lot of these conversations in really binary ways. It's like, do kids get social media? Do they not get social media? We assume that all potential forms of social media are equivalent. We can have social spaces that kids can hang out on that are not as compulsion causing, that don't turn kids into products the way they are right now, that don't have the same sets of incentives for kids. So, for example, one of the things that I worry a lot in like the sports space is the rise of fitness influencers who, both for boys and for girls, set really unrealistic expectations around like what is appropriate physical fitness, right? Which leads to things like injuries through inappropriate exercising, malnutrition, eating disorders for both boys and girls. A lot of that are artifacts of how these products are designed. You could still have spaces where kids could go learn exercises. You could still have spaces where kids could ask for advice and tips and find out what the latest cool trends are, without having them be spaces where almost all the content you see comes from a very small number of people, who are the people who have optimized the algorithms in the most extreme way. And so when we think about this question of like, what is safe for kids, or how do these things, have side effects that percolate out to other environments, it's not just about occupying the minutes they could be playing with their friends. It's even changing how they conceptualize what it means to move. or what it means to be healthy. And do we really want, an algorithm that is optimized on business interests, not even on the well-being of our kids, to be the thing that guides them down that path?
Absolutely. And parents will often feel, the overwhelm and the powerlessness within this. I mean, every parent wants to
Totally.
protect their child, and the house is on fire, so to speak, from kids as young as 5, 6 now on YouTube or some sort of social platform. And in many respects, we're facing what is the biggest mental health crisis of our kids today, and even physical, just whole health well-being. How can we approach it from accountability? You're a huge advocate for transparency,
Mm-hmm.
accountability for these tech platforms. Like, what is possible, but what is, even as you say, the floor of this? If we take the sports industry as an example, so the big sports brands, big sports organizations who are trying to reach these young Gen Alphas and Gen Zs, they need to be on these social platforms. There are advertisers there, but in effect are supporting these negative practices on kids' health.
Totally. I think there's a huge opportunity. This sounds super simple. Right now, these platforms are beholden to the advertisers. We saw with things like X, advertisers can make opinions about platforms and how they want to spend their brand dollars. And imagine a world where some of the biggest sports advertisers came out and said, hey, right now, we're giving you huge sums of money that's allowing you to treat kids this way. We're not going to tell you how to run your business, but we deserve at least 10 metrics. We're going to start out with just 10 metrics. 6 months from now, if you don't give us these 10 metrics once a month, we're going to go on a pause for a period of time on giving you more advertising dollars. And those could be questions like, did you witness eating disorder content this week? Did you witness self-harm content this week? Did you have trouble sleeping because of Instagram this week? How many kids were online at 9, 10, 11, 12, 1, 2, 3 a.m.? We could probably come up with 10 metrics that cover, the 5 worst problems on social media and say, hey, we're just starting there. All platforms should have to release at least those 10 metrics. And over time, we could grow that to 10, or to 20, or 30, or 40, or 100 metrics. We don't need full research or transparency to be able to shift some of those incentives. Because right now, like I said before, one of the things we learned from the AG lawsuits was that Meta had gone and talked to kids, and kids had said, when notifications go off in the school day, it makes it really hard for me to focus. It hurts my productivity. It makes me feel really stressed. When it goes off at night, I can't sleep. In a world where they had to publish numbers saying, I feel distracted by social media at school. I feel I have trouble sleeping because of social media. Like, what fraction of kids say yes to that? When they looked at that tiny little reduction in minutes spent per month, right? That was the reason they didn't launch that. They said kids use the platform a little bit less each month if you give them that control. They would have had something to weigh against it. And so when I say, we have options, I really think there's a huge opportunity amongst the fitness community to say, what if we got together and said, we want to give you the motivation to actually weigh your options a little bit longer. And the way we can do that is by working with those big advertisers, by coming together and demanding more.
And that conflict between profitability and addressing social issues, such as kids' mental health, physical health and well-being, that's foundational to the sports industry as a whole and the ecosystem. And as you talk about that was really my question, because these sports brands, if you take any of them, the Nikes, the Adidases of the world, they need to be on these social platforms. They're advertising, they're trying to get more kids moving. Is that content even reaching the kids? Is it, and then the other side of it then is, they're at the same time as advertising, they are supporting these negative practices. And so is there a world then in which you see these sports brands needing to come together? Because it's a little bit like, if one does it, then they may lose out, so it's really difficult because market share is everything. Is there a world in which we
100%.
have the sports industry, saying, coming together, or is there optionality to support an alternative social platform? Is that an alternative?
So that's one of these interesting things where, right now, part of what makes it harder for, say, a school community to come out and say, hey, there's not 5 social platforms. There's like 20 social platforms. You just haven't heard of most of them. Part of what makes it hard to have a meaningful conversation and say, hey, our school community is going to choose this over that, is that they don't have anything but marketing messages to compare them on. And I think there is a really big opportunity where if advertisers came out there and said, maybe it's not even a pure binary thing. It's not a thing where they say, hey, we are going to fully pull our ad dollars off of Meta's products. They could come and say, hey, in 6 months, we are going to allocate 10% of our funding dollars to platforms that publish these statistics. And a year from now, it's going to be 20% of our funding dollars are going to places that do these statistics. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing. We can think, like I always like to say, solutions are not binary. Paths to solutions are not binary. But one of the things that we've really not been given the opportunity on is to even have these conversations on how do we want to approach getting better. And that's because there's a lot of money out there being thrown around at nonprofits that tell us there are no solutions, or they create FUD saying, the data is really not in on whether or not kids are hurt by these things. And the thing I always like to remind parents on is, Mark Zuckerberg is going out on podcasts right now and repeating that over and over again. And yet the only person in the world who can actually allow that data to be collected, those, how the studies just don't exist, is Mark Zuckerberg. And so I find it very disingenuous when he's like, people really just don't understand how the data is not there. And it's like, yes, Mark, because you make sure the data is not there.
And I'm thinking about the power of collective action. Because what I love about your approach, Frances, is it's not an all or nothing. There are solutions, and there are initial solutions. What could be an initial stance that the sports industry could do to come together? Because ultimately this will improve their bottom line, even if there is any sort of small hit, and to do right by their customers, their future fans and kids.
So I think this is one of these things, like the sports industry could be coming together and saying, hey, we've approached a little bit collective action in schools around social media. So to give you an example on this, it's things like Wait for 8, which is a movement in the United States where, to make it a little easier on parents, you have a whole school say, we're going to wait till 14 to give kids 8th grade, to give kids smartphones. That way it's not a single parent being the bad cop, being like, oh, all of my kids' friends have smartphones, but like I'm having my kid wait. One of the benefits for the sports industry is if you facilitate these kinds of conversations in schools around which platform do we want our kids to be their main digital home? How do we want to educate kids on that they actually do have choices? Or this is kind of a shocking stat. They've run polls in the United States where they ask kids, how much would you pay to have none of your friends be on social media? And kids hate paying for things. And they're like, I would pay $50 to have my friends not be on social media. And I think there's this really interesting thing where if, places like Nike or, Adidas came out there, they did it together and said, hey, there are choices here. Like we're putting our money where our mouth is. 6 months from now, 10% of our ad dollars are going to go to platforms that publish these stats. We want your communities to make real choices. We want you to argue together, make choices together, saying this is how we want to live our lives. Because when you actually sit down with kids and talk to them about algorithms or about the business model or about the idea that they're the products being sold, kids get really angry. And, the key thing is when I hear a lot people saying things like, we need to teach them digital citizenship skills. Like they're going to live with these products for the rest of their lives. Part of the digital citizenship skills we should be teaching them is that they aren't powerless to use these things, that they have to use them. It's that they as a community can come together and say, hey, what role do we want these things to have in our lives? And I can think of few industries that would have a better vested interest in helping kids not be as addicted as the sports industry.
And I believe in the power of the sports industry. The summer we had the World Health Day on just inactivity, and we the World Federation for the Sporting Goods Industry really just rally the industry and all these sports brands to come together and say, we need to do something as an industry to fight physical inactivity. And we've seen that in that front. And it is important for these companies to be on the right side of that balance. Yes, we need to make profit, but be on the right side of the line of how we're affecting our customers. In play. I'm really curious to talk to you about an evolving space within sports is esports, and just given your experience with social media, how you think about or algorithms just shaping the world of esports. We have a lot of thoughts around maybe, okay, they encourage excessive gaming and giving new content and unhealthy gaming habits, and maybe even creating echo chambers and ultimately displacing kids from real world play. So I'd love to, maybe if you could help us understand a little bit more about that world.
In China, social media and video games are lumped under the same umbrella in terms of the restrictions that are placed on youth. So
Okay.
it maybe sounds shocking to kids in the United States, but if you're under 18, you get limited to about 40 minutes a day of video games or social media, and you get cut off at 10 p.m. at night. And the reason they make those decisions is every minute you're online after 10 p.m. is a minute you are either not studying or not sleeping. And so they've made societal decisions saying it is more important for you to have a chance to grow up and be a full, healthy adult than it is for your rights to be infringed to play video games after midnight on a school night. In the United States, 30% of all high school age students say they are on screens till midnight or later most school nights. It's pretty shocking. I also think there's a growing amount of data around performance gaps between young men and young women academically that can at least partially be attributed to the role of video games. There's data that I think can at least partially be attributed to the role of video games in terms of if you are going into school sleep deprived every day, if you are not spending time on homework that you could have been otherwise, had you, when you're in a situation where you have these incredibly optimized video games. Remember, there's thousands and thousands of people out there whose job is to figure out, can we get more minutes out of you every day? It's very similar incentives to what we see with social media. In some ways, they're even more socially engrossing because they're so much more interactive and there's so much more social energy, like interpersonal connection energy. And I think one of the things that's kind of sad about that is I think it's symptomatic of other trends we've seen in youth sports, where I don't know what the experience is in Europe, but in the United States, youth sports are getting hollowed out. There's like a kind of a flight to quality, if you will, where more affluent parents are putting their kids on travel teams that go no longer play just like the local teams. They go out of state. They have more professionalized coaching. But that means that lots of kids who in the past would have gotten access to team sports just don't get access anymore. Kids have a need to connect. They have a need to be in these spaces. And esports is a way that it can meet some of that need. But at the same time, I think it's a hollow approximation. You don't get the physical benefits of movement. You don't get the intersocial benefits of getting to resolve conflict in person, getting to see people's faces. Kids treat each other much more cruelly when all they hear is just yelling insults at each other. And so I think this is a symptom of some larger problems in society, and it will be a thing that we're going to have to address after we address social media.
Yeah, yeah. And I think there's conversations that we're not having. We're having the conversations thanks to you and a number of others around social media. And, technologists build the future. It accelerates fast, and civic institutions are trying to keep pace. And we're trying to do that around social media. And yet I feel like we're not having those conversations around whether it's esports or even if we dip into the metaverse. There's probably a lot more conversations that we are so far behind in that are just, and burgeoning. Frances, are you optimistic about where we're at?
I am optimistic. If you had asked me 3 years ago when I came forward, would we have a tobacco level lawsuit around social media? No, I could have never imagined that. Or would I have imagined that the Surgeon General would have come out and said, we need a black box warning on social media? No, could not have imagined that. Europe acted. They passed the Digital Services Act, which is like a landmark law. We have nation states, countries like Australia that are seriously talking about banning social media for under 16s. We are in a very different place in terms of how we have conversations about technology than when I came forward. And so I totally get it. It's really frustrating to see how slow things move, but that's how the world works. We learn, we respond, we change. It's happened with every other form of media we've ever invented. And we are going to keep building what I call the muscles of accountability. We need to practice having opinions and doing the research and organizing and building out the networks that allow us to counter big tech lobbyists. But once we have those muscles, we can use them for lots of things.
Frances, for those parents and people who would like to know more about what you're doing, your book is The Power of One, which they can purchase. Is there any other way that they can reach you? And is there a final message you have for people?
Well, I'm very open with my email address. So I'm frances@franceshaugen.com. I think there's going to be a bunch of opportunities in the next year for parents to raise these conversations with their local school communities. Like one of the things that I want to get more involved in is figuring out like how do we, plant experiences at school communities that facilitate having conversations like what platform do we want to choose to be our default home? We're going to need parents writing in and saying, hey, we need advertisers to demand data. Like you guys are the ones that are probably going to be the ones that make things move in the United States, just because like that's how we have trouble funding our own government versus even passing laws, right? And so it's going to be an exciting time, and I want people not to lose hope. What I always say to people is when you feel fatalistic, it means someone is trying to steal your power, because you always have the ability to raise your voice. It just takes a long time to get nicer things. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your time, Frances, your message and the work that you've done in advocating for many things, but among them kids' health and well-being. So appreciate your time here today. Thank you.